Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 35, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. We're more than halfway through May here, but you would not know it to look at our weather. May and June are typically our rainy months in Montana, but it has been cold here. And we were supposed to have a plant sale, a fundraising plant sale that I am the chairman for. That was supposed to happen this past Saturday, and I'm glad that we postponed it a couple of weeks because it was 45 degrees and raining, and I doubt that we would have sold very many plants. Conventional wisdom here in Montana is that you don't plant anything in your garden until Memorial Day weekend or until the snow is gone from the tops of the mountains, whichever comes first. And at this rate, it looks like it's going to be Memorial Day weekend at least. The good news is that because I can't get out into the garden to work, I've had a little bit of extra sewing time, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've been doing. I went to Seattle for Mother's Day weekend. My younger daughter lives there, and she just moved into a new apartment. She asked if I could come and help her get settled, so I went out there for a long weekend. We were busy enough that I didn't have a lot of time to do my usual round of trapline checking. I made it to the Recipient quilt shop in Issaquah, just east of Seattle, and also to Issaquah Sew and Vac. And I picked up a few purchases there, but I didn't make it to any Joann Fabrics, and I didn't make it to any Hobby Lobbies, and I didn't get to go to the mall and check out the Liz Claiborne section at JCPenney. So I'm a little bit adrift in terms of what's happening in fashion and fabrics, but I enjoyed my weekend very much. I did get an hour or so to run down to Pacific Fabrics, which is south of downtown Seattle. It's fairly easy to get to, and I like to go there and poke around a little bit. They've got a great selection of apparel fabrics. I picked up some new-to-me fabric, a new fabric line called Fabulism. The company is called Fabulism Supply Company, and I will put a link in the show notes. They say on their website that they are inspired by the colors found in nature, and although you know how I feel about muddy earth tones, I'm pleasantly surprised by the number of saturated colors in their fabric lines. And I picked up 3 yards of a color that's kind of I would describe it as a spruce color. It's not quite teal, it's not quite that blue, it's more green, but it's not quite a dark evergreen. So maybe mallard would be another good description of it. And that fabric is sitting on my cutting table, waiting to become either a new look 6344 blouse or a Simplicity 9469. These are two woven blouse patterns that are quite similar. They mostly differ in the neckline treatment. So Simplicity 9469 has a couple of variations. You can make a keyhole with a tie, or you can make a V-neck. I've made the V-neck version. New Look 6344 is one that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. You may know that they are having a clearance sale on all of their New Look patterns. They are 99 cents each. And I've picked up half a dozen or so New Look patterns in the past couple of weeks. I find that New Look patterns tend to fit me fairly well, although I'm at the top of the size range. I made the Simplicity 9469 out of some rayon linen blend fabric from Hobby Lobby. It was fabric that I got during one of their 40% off weeks, and I intended to use it for a wearable muslin, and it turned out nice enough that I do wear it quite a bit. The New Look 6344, I used some, wait for it, Cape Facet wide back cotton sateen that I got at the quilt store. And I don't typically make clothing out of quilting cottons. They're usually a bit stiff, but this was a wide back, and I happened to feel it, and it felt just beautifully silky soft and drapey enough that I was able to use it for the New Look blouse pattern. That one has a pleated neckline, and it fits really well as well. So I've now got 2 nice blouse patterns that I can use to make some summer blouses, which I am in desperate need of. I also spent this past Friday with the 11-year-old daughter of a friend of mine. My friend had posted on Facebook last week that her daughter was frustrated by the choice of clothing in stores. And oh my goodness, do I know how that feels. Those tween years are hard years to be shopping for clothing anyway. And to be frustrated by short shorts and belly shirts is adding insult to injury. So I suggested to my friend that her daughter come over and spend the day, which she did. Her daughter is in 4-H, so she's not unfamiliar with sewing, although I discovered from talking to her that their 4-H leader tends to cut everything out for them so that they don't have to use rotary cutters or scissors. And I get that. You don't want a bunch of little kids running around with sharp implements. But I'm also of the opinion that you learn by doing. So I handed this young woman a rotary cutter and I said, now is the best time to learn how to do this. So we picked a size for her from a basic t-shirt pattern, and we traced the pattern, and then we cut it out of the fabric. And I sat her down at my Bernina L860 serger. I was able to slow the speed down enough that it didn't feel like it was running away from her. And she did a great job. She did most of the t-shirt herself. I did the neckband and I hemmed it for her on the cover stitch machine. And she went home just thrilled that she had been able to make herself a t-shirt. So I expect that we will have a few more sewing days together in the coming weeks. And I will at least get her started on making her own clothes. Her mother told me that she has a serger. It's in the closet, so we might have to get it out and do a tune-up. But certainly this young woman has what she needs to make her own clothing. And my other accomplishment this week was getting the servo motor on my Juki 1541 sorted out. That machine came from the factory with the servo motor set at a particular speed, and even though I'm used to sewing on an industrial machine, I have an industrial serger with a clutch motor that I have absolutely no trouble sewing on. This machine had its speed set high enough that I was just not comfortable sewing on it. The motor did come with some instructions on how to change the settings. There are 2 buttons. One has an M above it and the other one has an arrow above it or below it. And you have to press those 2 buttons in a particular combination in order to change the speed. Except that I could not make heads or tails out of the instructions on how to do that. So I asked the question on the Vintage Industrial Sewing Machine group on Facebook, and a couple of guys jumped in with some helpful suggestions, and I was able to get the motor to slow down enough where I don't feel like I'm going to run over my finger. That machine came with an original foot on it that had a finger guard, but I took that foot off because I like narrow feet. And I replaced it with a narrow foot that doesn't have a finger guard. So I need to be fairly careful that I'm not just, sewing over my fingernail. I am glad to have that done because I've got a stack of projects that need to be finished on that machine, and I'd like to get them underway and get them taken care of. Okay, we have kind of a longish interview today, a little bit longer than normal. So I don't want to hold up the rest of the podcast, but I do want to take care of some housekeeping beforehand. We've picked up quite a few new listeners in the past couple of weeks, so welcome to all of you who may have just joined me. I want to let you know that there is a website for the podcast that has show notes for each episode, and the podcast website can be found at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. I also have a website at www.janetzabo.com. And if you go there, you can find my blog where I write 3 or 4 times a week about what's going on here in Montana. I've also got links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website where I have all of my knitting patterns for sale, and a link back to the podcast website if you should happen to forget where that one is. The podcast website has a guest form. If you think that you have a unique sewing story to tell, by all means, please fill out the guest form and submit it. I ask that people submit the form. I've had a few people say, "Oh, I'd love to be on your podcast," but I don't want to have to chase people down. It's easier for me in all things if you will fill out the guest form and submit it, because that goes into a database at the back end of my website, and that helps me to keep all of my contact information correct. You now have the option to submit what's called fan mail. There should be a link at the beginning of each podcast episode. If you click on that link, you can type a quick text message that goes to my podcast hosting company, and I get to read those comments and that feedback there. And I did have a few submissions last week, so that was exciting. Thank you for doing that. As always, if you'd like to leave a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever podcatcher you're using to listen to the podcast, I would appreciate it, because that does help people to find us. We're just about to the end of this blast of interviews that I've had. I'll have a few more coming up in the next couple of weeks, but I did quite a few interviews just because I knew I was going to be busy with all of our spring activities here, and having those interviews lined up gave me a little bit of breathing room. I have also discovered that doing interviews is one of my favorite parts of this podcast. I have gotten to meet some absolutely fascinating people, and today's guest is no different. I will be having a conversation with Lisa Sorrell, who is a custom boot maker from Guthrie, Oklahoma. And she's going to talk about how she got started in boot making and where she is now with her business, and where you can buy supplies, leather supplies, tooling, those kinds of things for making boots and handbags and other items. So if that's something that you're interested in, I think you'll find this very useful. And if not, I hope you'll enjoy the conversation, because Lisa is very engaging and entertaining. I am here with Lisa Sorrell, who is the owner of Sorrell Custom Boots. And I was just saying to her that I've never interviewed a bootmaker before, so this is a first. So welcome to the podcast, Lisa.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
And I always like to start out finding out how people got to where they are. So who taught you to sew, and what sparked your fascination with boots? Let's start there.
Okay. Well, I was raised in a conservative little church similar to Mennonite. So I grew up wearing long hair and long dresses. And women in our church made a lot of their own clothing. My mother began teaching me to sew at age 12. And it just made sense to me. By the time I was 14, I was helping her with sewing problems. And at 15, I began sewing professionally. So then at 20, my husband and I married and moved from Missouri, where I'd been living, to Oklahoma. And I left my sewing business behind. And after 6 months in a 3-room apartment, I got bored. I answered an ad in the paper for stitching boot tops. I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded like sewing. And that's how I found cowboy boot making.
Wow, that's really cool. And I have to tell you that I do belong to a Mennonite church here.
Okay. Well, we weren't Mennonite, but that's the closest I can come to describing it. We looked like Pentecost, but we didn't speak in tongues. We didn't wear the little white caps. A little conservative religion.
When I tell people that I go to a Mennonite church, they're surprised, but it's one of the more progressive Mennonite churches. Yeah, we don't adhere to traditional dress anymore. They used to. So what was it like when you started stitching these boot tops? Were you surprised?
It was an education in all sorts of ways. For one thing, I had never been around anyone who drank or cussed. And Jay Griffith, the bootmaker that I was working for, was an alcoholic. he never fired people. He only made their lives miserable until they quit. And I learned later that he didn't have the budget to have a whole bunch of employees. So, like me, he hired me to stitch boot tops. There was already a lady in there stitching boot tops when he hired me. So, what he did is he would just hire anyone off the street, and then whichever one was worse, he would make their life miserable until they quit and keep the one that was better. And I immediately showed potential. So the other poor lady, her life got terribly hard very quickly. And then she left screaming as she went out the door. And of course, he was screaming and cussing. And that was just the way that shop operated. His stepson worked in the back building the boots, and they would have these giant screaming, cussing matches. And I would go hide in the bathroom and cry.
Oh my goodness. That's a terrible business model.
It was, but I was just immediately fascinated with what I was doing. I didn't know that people could make shoes. I thought all shoes were just sort of like spat out of a machine in a factory somewhere. I didn't know people could make shoes. I had never worn cowboy boots. I'd never even thought about cowboy boots. And suddenly I'm helping make footwear. One of the things about my church is that as a rule, girls did girl things and boys did boy things. And like we would have a camping trip for the young people, and the boys went hiking and the girls cooked and cleaned up,
Uh-huh.
which was the way that worked. And so I loved sewing, but the thing I didn't like about sewing is I was conforming to gender expectations. Girls were expected to learn to sew, and I hated that aspect of it. So then when I found bootmaking, I got to sew and I got to design pretty things, but I also got to hammer. And I just loved that marriage of art and craft and feminine and masculine.
So how long did you stay in that boot shop?
I worked for Jay for a year and a half. And what you have to understand about being an employee in a boot shop is that he paid me to do my job. So he taught me how to do my job and then paid me to do it. He was not being nice and training me to be a bootmaker and all of those things. He was paying me to do my job. But of course, I did pick up some skills, and I became a very good top stitcher. That's what the person who does the decorative work on cowboy tops is called, as a top stitcher. And I became a very good top stitcher. So after a year and a half, Jay's business was winding down. His health was not good. And I had to leave after a year and a half. And I knew that if I didn't find a way to stay in the business, that I would lose it completely. So I started calling and sending out letters to bootmakers across the country. And I bought myself a sewing machine, and I announced that I would stitch boot tops independently for other bootmakers. That required them to mail me their boot tops, and I would stitch them and send them back. And it was kind of unique. Not many people had done that, but I built up a good business, and that enabled me to stay in the trade long enough, 2 or 3 years later, that I found a bootmaker to train me. And so the way that works is I paid him to train me. I get people often who say, "Oh, I want to learn bootmaking. How much do you pay?" No, it doesn't work that way. You have to pay for that education. And I actually don't train beginners anymore anyway.
So what kind of sewing machine were you using when you were doing the top stitching?
I use a Singer 110W, either 124 or 125. They're basically the same machine. It's an industrial machine from the 1940s, I think. It still had an old clutch motor. The one that I use for my own work still has the original clutch motor. I have machines with servos, but I learned to sew on a clutch, and it doesn't bother me.
So you were doing the top stitching kind of as an independent contractor for these other companies. At what point did you decide to take the leap?
I'd wanted to all along, but the problem is always finding someone who teaches. Even now, I get emails often looking for someone to teach, and I just don't know who to recommend. But I was incredibly lucky that when my husband and I married and moved to Guthrie, Oklahoma, it happened to be a town with a bootmaker in it. And then after Jay died, two of his students set up shop here, and I worked for one for a while, and then the other one agreed to teach me. And we've just always had bootmakers in Guthrie, which is completely unusual. There's no other town in Oklahoma that I could have moved to with that sort of situation. And it was just completely luck.
Wow. So how long did your training last?
I paid him for 2 months of training, and then he allowed me to stay for a year and a half as an unpaid apprentice, which again was a fantastic and unheard of opportunity. Typically, most of the classes that you take now are 2 or 3 weeks, and then after you finish your class, you're gone, go back home, you're on your own.
Wow.
But since I lived in town and since I brought skills to him, I already knew how to stitch boot tops. He let me stay for free because I paid for my time there with the work that I could do for him.
He was doing custom boots, I assume. So people would come in and say, I want this, I want this.
Exactly. That's how that works. You come in and we measure your feet and talk to you about leather and design choices and colors and all of that. And then typically most bootmakers take a deposit. Uh, Common waiting time for custom made boots is around a year to year and a half. So you'll come in, you'll get measured, you'll tell me what you want, and I'll put you on the calendar. You'll place a deposit to hold your spot on the calendar. And then a year and a half from now, I finally make it to your spot on the calendar and I make your boots.
This is an investment for people.
It is. And custom made cowboy boots are really an interesting product in that they are still in use by working cowboys. Cowboy boots are working gear and cowboys need them, but they're also expensive. And so they are working gear that cost a lot of money, but is part of the clothing that cowboys need to wear. And then on the other hand, they're also a luxury item. You know, if you want to come in and spend $15,000 on a pair of boots just so you can brag to your friends, you can do that too.
Yes,
And people do.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. I live in Kalispell, Montana, and while we don't have cowboys necessarily in this part of the state, I am familiar with that culture and especially
Mhm.
with the people who like to spend lots of money on boots. But I'm just thinking in terms of my husband has a pair of cowboy boots and he has had them resold several times. They've lasted, I mean, he's had them for over 30 years.
And see, that's the thing. A custom made cowboy boot, you cannot compare the quality to a factory boot. It can be repaired, it can be restored, but we don't have a culture that encourages that sort of purchase. And we also don't have a culture that educates people about why that sort of purchase is important. We live in a very disposable culture. We
Right.
buy something cheap, wear it for 6 or 8 months and throw it away. And no one thinks about how an average starting price for cowboy boots is around $2,000. That's kind of an average base price. And so you can get a work boot for anywhere from $1,800 to $2,500. And most people don't sit down and think about what they're spending over time when they're buying $100 boots or whatever boots cost in the store. I don't even know because I've never had of boots from the store. But if they're paying $100 for a pair of boots, but replacing them every 6 months, they don't sit down and think about how those costs compare.
Exactly. So you said that you enjoyed the top stitching part of it. Can we talk a little about the design work that goes into a
Absolutely.
boot? Okay. That sounds like that's what really cranks your gears.
I do love it. I love all of it, but top work is easier to talk about because it's visible and it uses terms that people understand more. If I talk about construction, I would be using all sorts of terms that aren't easily apparent to the average person. Well, the way a cowboy boot starts when I'm doing construction, uh, so first, boots are built around a last, which is the plastic form. And a last is not foot shaped. A last is shoe or boot shaped, but it's built to accommodate a foot. So the first thing I would do after I measure your feet is choose your last because that helps me know how to pattern the tops. Once I have the last, then I know how to pattern the tops. After I get there, then I'm going to create your boot top pattern, and then I'm going to start on the design. I do all of my designs by hand. Occasionally, I just designed something recently that had a trillium. So I went to the computer and looked up trilliums and printed some out so I could get the proportions right. But when it comes down to it, I'm drawing it by hand. I might trace a trillium and then make some changes if I need to, but I'm drawing everything by hand. And then once I get the design the way I like it, and I will say that traditional cowboy boot themes for designs are butterflies and flowers. People think that those are feminine, but they're not. They're traditional. There aren't really any gender lines in cowboy boots. You can wear high heels and bright colors and butterflies if you want to. And it doesn't mean man or woman. It just means traditional cowboy boot. Also, cowboy boot designs are mostly symmetrical. There are occasionally exceptions to that, but as a rule, they're symmetrical. So I just draw out one side of the pattern. I prefer to work on the right side of the pattern. A typical boot top is a front panel and a back panel, and those are usually the same. So I draw one top pattern that's going to be both my front panel and my back panel pattern. And then on the right side of it, I create my design, and then I fold it in half and I stitch it on my sewing machine with no thread in the needle. And that creates a poster board pattern with little holes in it. And so then I can lay that pattern piece on my leather, and then I have an old sock with baby powder, and I rub that over the poster board. And then when I lift off the poster board, I have little white dots that show me where to cut or stitch. That's leather inlay and overlay. So if I cut out a butterfly shape and laid it on top of the leather, that would be overlay. And then I would stitch it into place. If I cut out a butterfly shaped hole and put a different colored piece of leather behind, that's inlay. And then there's also multiple row stitching, which is probably the most common. If you see boots, they don't have inlay and overlay, they just have stitching. In a shop like mine, that's done one row at a time on my old Singer sewing machine. There's not a computer with multiple needles. There's one needle, and I stitch one row, and then I go back and stitch very close to it, and then I go back and stitch very close to it, and I've done up to 20 rows.
So inlay and overlay almost sounds like applique and reverse applique.
Yes, it's very similar. The difference between leather and fabric is that fabric frays and leather doesn't, the edges. But on the other hand, with leather, when you layer pieces together like that, the edges need to be thinned. Otherwise, you have a bump or a ridge where pieces join. So leather has to be skived, which means thinning the edges down at an angle. So if I'm doing overlay, I'm doing a very, very narrow skive around the edges because I want the edge to be thinned down, but I also want to be sewing through full or almost full thickness of leather. So anything that goes over has a narrow skive, but anything that goes under, I do a very wide skive, so it will seamlessly blend underneath that piece.
And what kinds of thread are you using?
It's bonded nylon, and I'm using size 11. I work mostly with kangaroo leather, which is very thin, but also strong. And I use a size 11 needle and number 33 thread, which is Tex 30, I believe.
Okay. That's thinner than I expected.
Yes, everyone thinks because it's leather, it's a great big needle and great big thread, but no,
Right.
decorative work is very fine and beautiful.
And I'm looking at your workshop. What is that machine just behind you?
That's a post machine.
So
So the bobbin's up in a post.
in addition to the Singer, you use the post machine for.
I use the post machine for construction. So the foot part of a cowboy boot is called the vamp, and the heel area is the hard piece that touches your heel and supports your heel is called the counter, and the decorative piece on the outside that you see is the counter cover. And I use that post machine to sew on the vamps and counters because it gives me a little more maneuverability since the bobbin's up in a post.
Okay, that makes sense. You can't do a lot of that on a flatbed machine.
Yeah, it would be difficult. And see, occasionally I make one piece tops. So a one piece top, instead of having a side seam up each side, it has one seam up the back. And to get down in there to sew that entire seam, I need a post machine so I can kind of fold everything down around the post.
What has been the most challenging part of this business?
Probably the most challenging thing was building up the muscle I needed. I
Really?
don't build boots full time anymore, so I've lost a lot of muscle. I started a business selling leather tools and supplies to other boot and shoemakers, and it has taken over my life. So I spend a lot of time on the computer now. But when I was building boots full time, I had to build up a lot of muscle. It is a very physical craft. And when I first started it, I went through a year or so where I just wanted to eat eggs and hamburgers and red meat all the time. And I don't even like red meat and I hate hamburgers. So if I'm craving a hamburger, you know something's going on.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that end of it, that it would be so physical, but that makes sense.
It is, it's very physical and there's lots of specialty tools that help you with the task. And I'm not very big, so I'm always looking for tools that give me good leverage.
So you were featured on PBS's Craft in America series. How did that work? Did they come and set up shop in your, or, follow you around for a week or?
Yes, they came in for, I think it was 3 days. When I have a situation like that, I usually try to get several different boots in different stages so that I can demonstrate different parts of the production process. And I'm sure I did that. And I think they were here for 3 days.
And you've also written some books?
I've written a book, The Art of Leather Inlay and Overlay, and that
Okay.
just simply details how to do leather inlay and overlay. That was an interesting book to write. I always say, imagine writing a baking cookbook for an audience that has never seen a stove, doesn't know how to use measuring cups or spoons, and has no idea where to buy butter. So when I was trying to write that book, I kept thinking, okay, I'll start here. I'll tell them this. And I'd realize, no, wait, I can't tell them that until I explain this. But before I explain that, I have to explain that. And I kept going in circles trying to figure out where to dive in because I couldn't just say, pick up your skiving knife. I had to tell you what a skiving knife is. And then I couldn't just say, skive this edge because I had to tell you what skiving meant and how to hold the knife and what you were trying to achieve and why. It was very difficult to find a jumping off point for that book.
Oh, that's interesting. I,
I even threw in there's a section on how to time your sewing machine
oh,
because I
really?
just had to tell you everything.
Right? I was looking at your blog. You were talking about attaching the boot to the last and
Mhm.
how there's a particular way to do it and it wasn't working the way you were doing it, so you did it the wrong way.
Ah, yes, that pair of boots. Yeah, I was making a pair of boots with an ostrich foot, and when you cut leather, leather doesn't have a stretch like fabric, but it does have stretch. And you have to cut your leather with or against the stretch so that it will go on the last properly. And this pair was ostrich. And if ostrich has a direction of stretch that's predictable, I have never found it. With ostrich, just cut it however you want to cut it and cross your fingers and hope for the best. And ostrich loves to twist. And this particular pair of boots, I would put it on the last. It would be nice and straight. And then I would pull that final nail at the heel to pull it down and finalize the lasting process. And it would just go sideways. And it did that several times. And typically what you do is you last in the toe area first, and then you pull the heel down. And that was not working. So I ended up having to last in the heel first to make sure it was straight and then do the toe. And it did fight back quite vigorously.
So knowing the
It,
rules, it also means knowing when to break the rules.
that is so true. Um, Sometimes I love public speaking. It's one of my favorite things. And so I often give presentations about the rules. This is how you do things. And it annoys me when there's a beginner who does something and then they do it wrong and they're like, oh, this is deconstructed. No, you don't get to use that argument. You have to know what you're doing before you start breaking the rules. Like if at my point in my career, if I do something wrong, I've done it on purpose and there's a reason. But if you make a pair of shoes and you do everything wrong, you didn't know why and you didn't know what you were trying to do in the first place.
Do you teach?
Um, I prefer to teach by speaking now. I don't typically teach in my studio anymore, and I can't teach bootmaking anywhere other than my studio because so far I haven't found a college or a craft school that has all of the equipment necessary for a boot shop. So my choices are teach in my studio or not at all. And I can't because of the supply business. My phone rings all the time. Occasionally, I will take an experienced bootmaker. That is my favorite thing to do. This is a difficult craft. It's physically difficult. It's hard to make money at it. It's hard to make a living at it. You need lots of support. And so that is my favorite thing to do is find a bootmaker who's progressing well, but they've just hit a wall. They've reached a point where their work isn't getting better, or they're having problems with this one thing and they don't know why. And I love to invite someone like that into my shop and spend time with them and just push them over that hump and then watch them go.
It sounds like if you have this business selling supplies for bootmaking and there are people out there like that, then bootmaking doesn't sound to me to be a dying craft. Is that true? Are there people up and coming who are willing to carry on?
I wouldn't refer to it as dying, but it is definitely threatened. So one of the issues is that, as I said, it's expensive craft. There's machinery and tools that you need starting out. And then you're going to make a lot of mistakes when you're starting. You're not going to have a good customer base. So you're going to lose money for a few years. Not everyone can afford to lose money. What happens is the people who can afford to lose money tend to be retired from something else, which is great. I welcome everyone. But here's the thing. I started bootmaking when I was 21. I just turned 21. And I didn't begin teaching until I had been doing it for 20 years. At 20 years, I suddenly felt this compulsion to teach. Like I realized that I was in a place where I could and I needed to. If you don't start this until you retire at 55 or 65, you don't have those 20 years to put into it before you can teach. And like I said, I welcome everyone. I'm glad they're in the trade, but we need young people in it so that they can learn everything they need to and then turn around and pass it on. It's difficult for young people to do it because they can't be losing money. They need to buy groceries and make a house payment. Another thing that makes this industry threatened is supplies. And that's the reason I'm doing what I'm doing. Just for instance, during the pandemic, so the sole of cowboy boots are typically, they have a double row of wooden pegs in the soles. These are little short wood pegs. They look kind of like toothpicks, but they're square. This is both traditional and functional. This is very important for the construction of a cowboy boot, is the wood pegged sole. There are 3 factories left in the world who make wood pegs. All 3 of them quit during the pandemic. So one of them is in the US. They are still using leftover Civil War equipment to make wood pegs. They can no longer make the size that we need for bootmaking. That leaves 2 companies in Europe that make wood pegs. One of them said, we're never going to make them again. Sorry. So now we have 1 factory in the entire world that makes wood shoe pegs. If they decide to quit, not only am I out of business, but during the time when they were impossible to get, I had factories in Mexico contacting me, begging me for pegs. And that is the knife edge that this trade rests on. Even if we get young people into it, even if we teach them, if we lose the supplies and the suppliers, we're done.
I follow a lot of clothing historians on Twitter, and several of them have made comments to the effect that they'll look at old clothing, vintage clothing, historical clothing, museum pieces, and they'll say, we don't have the technology, we don't know how to do this anymore.
Yes. And that's another thing. This trade has typically been passed along orally from master to apprentice. Very little has been written down. There's one decent book on how to make cowboy boots, but it was published several years ago, so it's black and white line drawings. not full color pictures. And then there's my book on leather inlay and overlay. It's not about boot making, it's just inlay and overlay. I would like to do something similar to it for the entire craft of boot making. But basically, if we stop passing it along, it will die and there will be no way to resurrect it because it wasn't written down. So I get what they're saying. And then, like you said, there's just the supply aspect of it. I have a friend in Sweden who is the last remaining master hat maker in the world. So we're talking like top hats. And she bought, I think, 250 yards of hat silk from a factory in France before it burned down. And they were the last remaining hat silk factory. So when these things happen, when the supplies are gone, it's very tough to find a way forward.
It's almost like species going extinct.
Yeah, and you're watching it in real time.
Right. So you're concentrating more on the supply end of things now. Is that where you see your business going?
The supply business has given me the freedom that I've wanted for several years. Um, I said before, this is a hard way to make a living, and it is. And I've put in my time. And my body shows it. My hands show it. I'm at the point where I don't want to stop making boots, but I want to stop making boots for money. I've raised my prices a whole lot. I only rarely ever take orders. Sometimes it's because I just send you to someone else, and sometimes often it's because they don't want to pay my prices. I'm trying to cut my business way, way down and only make the boots I want to make for the people I want to make them for. And about 7 years ago, I experienced a really terrible personal tragedy. It made it difficult to work in my shop for a long time. And I realized that I needed to find joy again. That was the only way I could go forward, is to do this with joy. And this was how I solved the problem. I want to make boots because I love them. And I want to pass the craft on because I love it. And I can't just do it for money anymore.
I appreciate your philosophy. You do get to a point in your life where you realize what matters.
Absolutely. Yeah, part of it was age and part of it was just, life. And I realized that's what I had to do. Even if it meant I quit, I
Right.
couldn't I couldn't do it as a job anymore. It just hurt too bad.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you'd like to talk about?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, it's been fun talking to you, like just with the post machine. I could jump right to the knowledge that you know what a post machine is. And I love integrating with fiber arts because we have so much shared knowledge, and I feel like leather artists and boot and shoemakers are kind of the forgotten ones in the fiber arts, because I didn't realize this until recently, but leather is classified as a textile. And that's one reason I wrote the Leather Inlay and Overlay book, because what if there are people in the textile industry who want to work with leather? Guess what? There's no information out there. I remember I was at the Smithsonian Craft Show one time. I did that for a couple of years. And there was a lady there who was making this wonderful jewelry out of leather. And I said, "This is great. What kind of leather are you using?" And she looked at me and she said, "I don't know." And that's the tip. I'm not making fun of her. I'm just saying that's a typical amount of information out there. This is leather. And then you don't know, is it sheep? Is it kangaroo? Is it calf? Is it ostrich? Is it alligator? What are the qualities of each of those leathers? How do they feel when you use them? What are they best suited for? How do they skive? How do they stitched? None of this is taught. And my book is just a tiny little attempt to address that.
I've done a little bit of bag making. I haven't done anything with leather. So, I've kind of dipped my toes into that part of the pool where people are working with leather. And so when you said skiving, I at least had heard that term. And yes, I know what
Hooray!
I and I know what a post bed machine looks like. And so I have enough knowledge to be dangerous. But you're right that leather is a textile. it should be treated as, as part of that whole.
No, it's kind of the forgotten sibling in the textile world. And I think I can't be angry about it because it's not as accessible as fabric. You
Yeah.
can't, fabric stores are getting much rarer now. I completely understand that. But you can't go to your local leather store. I mean, there are Tandies, but even Tandy leather doesn't have the sort of leather that you need for leather inlay and overlay. They're going to have heavy stuff for a different type of craft. There's not much recognition that there are different crafts within leather and different ways to use leather, different leathers that are suitable for various things. There's just no information out there.
Let's say we have people in the audience who are listening and thinking that they want to start working with leather, be it maybe they want to do boots, maybe they want to do handbags. What advice would you give them on how to seek out that information?
Okay, first of all, I want to say that even though I sell supplies, here's my sales philosophy. If you buy stuff from me, I'll like you. If you don't buy stuff from me, I'll still like you. I'm not a salesman. Having said that, often the only place to recommend for supplies is myself. There's not a lot of places to get this stuff. So for instance, kangaroo is my favorite leather to work with. If you're making handbags, if you're making boot tops, if you're wanting to do leather inlay and overlay, kangaroo is the leather you want to work with. It skives better than any other leather. When I teach a leather inlay and overlay class, I cut my expensive kangaroo into strips and give it to students to learn to skive. I don't want to give them crappy leather from Tandy because then all they'll learn is to hate skiving. They have to work with the best leather. So if you decide I want to learn skiving and you start with an unsuitable leather, you're going to think, I don't know how to skive. I can't master this craft. It's too hard. You need to start with kangaroo. Guess what? I'm the only place in the US that carries kangaroo in colors. So there are places to get black and brown, but if you want hot pink and yellow, you're going to have to come to me. And I'm sorry if that's self-serving, but really you need kangaroo and you need a proper skiving knife, which I also sell. If there are other people carrying the things you need, I will tell you. I'm not at all going to try to gatekeep and only make sure you buy from me. But oftentimes there really aren't other options.
And that's, people need to know that. I don't think that you're here to, do some kind of heavy-handed sales pitch. I'm giving you the opportunity
I'm
to.
not. Mhm.
How can people find you?
I have a feeling that if you Google shoemaking supplies, you're going to find me very quickly.
Okay.
But my website is Sorrell, SORRELL .shop, SHOP.
You have a blog.
I do. My blog is whatwouldlisado.net because when I teach classes, I would often hear students over in the corners going, what would Lisa do? And so my blog is whatwouldlisado.net. I'm also on Instagram at Sorrell Custom Boots.
Okay. And I will put links to all of this in the show notes. So.
I answer a lot of questions. People email me with questions. People call me with questions. I prefer emails because then I can answer them on my own time.
Well, it has been wonderful talking to you. And I think that this has been a great addition to the podcast lineup.
I am so thrilled to be able to tell people a little more about leather and possibly expose people to ways that they can work with leather if they wish to.
Great. Well, we can definitely have you back on to talk about it again.
Sounds fun. I'm in.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It was lovely to talk to you.
Again, I hope you'll check the show notes for further information and resources. I have links to Lisa's website and to other resources there. Feedback and suggestions for future shows are always welcome. So I hope that you will have a great week until our next episode and that you'll get to go sew something.